What if Uncle Ben lived in Spider-Man 2002? What if events went differently? What if Peter stopped the robber and saved Uncle Ben? What would have happened? What would have changed? Find out in this fan fiction. Before we get into this fan fiction, I just want to say that it's been crazy doing these, and I know I've been slowing down a bit on these, but I do want to get back on track. I do have part 2 coming out for Green Goblin. I really want to do that soon, and this is just a amazing, probably crazy fan fiction mixed with a lot of different things that you're going to find out. And I don't know, like, I just think this was done really well, and we might have to make a part 2 for this. But anyways, guys, let's get into the fan fiction. The events would be playing out the same, just like our original timeline. Peter would win the wrestling match and defeat Bonesaw. He would ask for the $3 grand, but just like the original timeline, the guy would say he missed the part where that was his problem. Peter would be infuriated, and he would slam the desk and he would leave. The robber would enter the building and point a gun at the wrestling host. Peter, just about to leave the building, would hear something. The guy would yell, telling Peter to stop that guy, and Peter would think, if he stops him, maybe the guy will give him the $3 grand for the wrestling match, and something would flicker in his mind, and he would use his hands and throw him into a wall. The robber would be knocked out and the cops would arrest him. Flint Marko would be outside telling Ben that he needed the car, and he kept looking around to see where his partner was. Why was it taking so long? Peter would talk to the wrestling host, and he couldn't believe his eyes. He stopped the robber in the nick of time. He would take the bag of money from the cops, and he would give it to Peter, saying he deserved the money, and he would offer Peter a full-time position as a wrestler, and Peter would smile and he would think about it. He would go down the elevator and he would be walking on the street like the original timeline. And he couldn't believe his eyes. Somebody would throw Uncle Ben to the ground, and he couldn't even believe it, what was happening. He didn't know how much time he had. Peter would scream, and he would use his webs, and he would look around, knowing he might only have one chance to save Uncle Ben, and he would jump in the air. And Flint Marko would be shocked, and he would look around, turning around, but he would be kicked in the face, and the gun would drop in the air. Uncle Ben would scream at Peter, and Peter would punch Flint Marko again and again until he was bleeding, and Uncle Ben would yell at Peter to stop, saying, "Remember what I told you," and Peter would drop him to the ground. And Flint Marko would be crying, saying that he only needed the money for his sick daughter, and he would cry, screaming she was dying, and Peter would look at the money, and he knew what he had to do, and Uncle Ben would put his hand on Peter's shoulders, and he knew what needed to be done, and Peter would give the money to Flint Marko, and he would yell at Flint Marko to get lost, and Flint Marko would be running as fast as he could, and he would get away for the time being. The cops would ask what happened, and Uncle Ben would tell the cops not to worry about it, and it was taken care of. He would tell Peter he did the right thing by giving him the money, and Peter would explain he went to the wrestling match, and he actually never went to the library, and he told Uncle Ben he wanted the money to impress MJ. They would get into the car, and Uncle Ben would tell Peter that if she likes him, that he wouldn't need to impress her with a car, and that everything would fall into place at some point. He would say that he was proud of him and that he did the right thing, and Peter would tell Uncle Ben that he wasn't okay, and that after the science trip he was bitten by a radioactive spider, and he's been given these weird powers, and they were out of this world. He would tell Uncle Ben he didn't know what to do, and he would cry. Uncle Ben would tell Peter that he's been given a gift, and he would tell him to take his hand. They would shake hands, and Uncle Ben would explain that after he helped him, that he used his great power responsibly, and that he should continue doing what he was doing. He would explain that there was a hero in all of us, but he would explain to Peter that he can do a lot more than regular people, and he would point at his spider logo under his sweater, and Peter would look at it, and he knew what he needed to do. Peter would craft his Spider-Man 2002 suit, and Uncle Ben would tell him that it looked good. Aunt May would be told by Uncle Ben about Peter's powers, and they would be happy for him. They would say that they were proud of him, and Peter would leave the house crawling up a wall, and he would do his first swing, and he would make his way to the city of New York. Peter would be fighting crime, and he would beat up criminals, saving them for the cops. Peter would fight people like Shocker, the Prowler, and even Mysterio for his first encounters with villains. Peter would graduate high school, and in this timeline, Uncle Ben and Aunt May would attend the graduation, and Peter would not move with Harry to New York City, and Norman Osborn wouldn't be a father figure to Peter, because in this timeline, Uncle Ben ends up living, so Norman Osborn, he would still take the Goblin Serum, becoming the Green Goblin. Peter would be more experienced Spider-Man, but he would have flaws that he never truly learned. With great power must also come great responsibility the hard way. So he hasn't suffered a loss in this timeline. Peter would be working 2 jobs in this timeline, getting money from everywhere. He was able to support Uncle Ben and Aunt May, and he would continue to be an attraction at the wrestling shows, and he would be sponsored by the Daily Bugle, who would write articles for his upcoming matches, and he would also be working at the Daily Bugle as Peter Parker, taking pictures of Spider-Man. During the expo, Peter would go with Uncle Ben and Aunt May, and things would kind of get crazy in this timeline. They'd be looking around, and Uncle Ben would tell Peter if he was having a good time, but his spider sense would go off, and he would tell Uncle Ben something was wrong and that they had to leave. Uncle Ben would look at Peter, saying, "Remember, with great power," and Peter would look back at both of them, and then they would run into the crowd, and Green Goblin would be laughing, and he would throw a pumpkin bomb, and it would hit like the original timeline, but this time, Spider-Man came prepared, and Goblin would look at his co-workers from Oscorp, and he would say, "Out am I," and he would throw a pumpkin bomb. But Spider-Man would say, "You're the one who's out," and he would use his webs and catch it and throw it back at him. It would explode in the air, and Peter would have a ripped up suit, and the explosion would make him go flying into a wall. The Green Goblin's glider would be on fire, and he would have to ditch his glider, and he would fall onto the ground in the air, and the boardmen from Oscorp would still be alive. Peter would save them by making a net for them with webs, and he would save Harry and MJ, and Spider-Man would use his webs to the ground, propelling him, and he would use all of the force, and it would go directly to the Goblin's head, and his mask would almost be cut clean off. Goblin would punch Spider-Man back, and he would use his legs to kick him in the face, but Spider-Man would fall to the ground, and Green Goblin would laugh, but would be kicked into the burning glider, and half of his suit would catch on fire, and Green Goblin would scream. Spider-Man in time would use his webs to pull him off the glider, and he would kick him in the ribs, and he would make him fall to the ground. He would punch him in the face, and his mask would fall off, and he couldn't believe his eyes. It was Norman Osborn. Norman would be on the ground, defeated. The cops and the fire trucks would come in time, and Spider-Man would tell them that it was Norman Osborn, and that things were starting to make sense now because of the stolen equipment at Oscorp, and they would put him in the ambulance, and they would arrest him for terrorism. Oscorp would be taken over by Quest Aerospace, and Norman would be thrown in jail at Ravencroft. Harry Osborn would break up with MJ, and he would go into a downward spiral. Uncle Ben and Aunt May would take him in, and Harry would be living with Peter. Peter would construct a new suit, looking more like the Spider-Man 2 costume, and as a gift, the board members would want to thank Spider-Man, and they would give him the key to the city earlier, so instead of Spider-Man 3, he ends up getting it earlier for defeating the Green Goblin and putting him in jail. Spider-Man would go there, and Quest Aerospace would tell him that they had a reward for him, and they would reveal a brand new suit, taking the red curtain off, and it would be Spider-Man's silver and black MK1 costume. They would all clap, and the crowd of people would clap for him, and he would put it over his new suit, and he would look over the crowd, and he would end up seeing Flint Marko with his wife and daughter, and they would be smiling, clapping. And back at Ravencroft, they would have Norman Osborn being held in a glass tube with other villains like Cletus Cassidy, Chameleon, and the Shocker. These villains didn't meet Spider-Man yet, but they were already in the facility, and for revenge, people in Quest Aerospace would do experiments on Norman for military research. They would give him too much Goblin Serum, and his skin would start turning green, and there would be an explosion, and Spider-Man would be swinging in his brand new costume, and he would hear the explosion go off, and he couldn't believe his eyes. And that's where we're going to end. What if Uncle Ben lived in Spider-Man 2002? Now, I really wanted to add in a ton of things where we're kind of going in a direction of like the MK1 universe from the 90s, where like it's pretty much a perfect world for Peter Parker, but we're also getting into some crazy stuff by entering having the Ultimate Universe, by having Ultimate Green Goblin now. So things are really getting spiced up here. And What If Uncle Ben Lived Part 2, that might actually come out sooner than later. You know, this might be a shorter What If, but I thought I would pack everything in here and just give it to you guys. But anyways, let me know your thoughts on this fan fiction, and if you guys did enjoy this video, do make sure to subscribe, like, share, and turn your notifications on so you and your friends are all up to date with the latest content. But anyways, as always, peace out.